Check. Okay. Hi, I'm just waiting for a couple more people to join. But Alyssa, let me know if you can hear me.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, hi.
Okay.
Sorry, hang on, I'm trying to. Okay, yeah, I can hear you perfectly. I was like, I don't think it'll let me start a video or start my video, but I'm here. I just have to bounce off a little early to go to like an instrument class. But
Oh,
thank
that's
you.
exciting.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah,
Okay.
I forgot you're the helicopter pilot, right?
No, that might be a different Alyssa. I'm just yeah, a regular pilot or just a student pilot working on my PPL and
Oh, that's
also it is my
exciting.
yeah.
Are you, is this your first Zoom ground with us?
I think I have been to another one of yours before.
Okay.
I can't remember if it was like maybe 6 months ago, but yeah,
Okay,
been to
awesome.
that
Well,
one.
welcome
Yeah,
back.
thank you. Yeah, I'll hopefully get to fly helicopters one day, but one thing at a
Yeah.
time, I guess. Okay, cool. I'll mute myself then so it
Okay,
doesn't distract
cool. And
anybody.
then, hi, Marissa. Good to see you back here. Do you have any updates on flight training? Or let me know if you can hear me. I'll wait a little bit longer to see if anyone else joins. Okay, cool. Side note, I think for once I actually got my ability to share. I feel like I always get some sort of technical difficulty through this, so let me see if I can actually share my screen this time. Okay, can you guys see my screen? Okay, perfect. Cool. Let me just see if anyone else entered the waiting room. Cool. Okay, I think I have one more person who just joined. Okay. Hi. Uh, cool. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and get started. So today I'm going to talk about risk management. And this is a concept that I'm sure you guys have already been introduced to. With flight training, we talk about the risks pretty much anytime we learn a new lesson with flight training. But this ground will be a teaching on a more methodical way of approaching risk and mitigating it. on a more, I guess, in a more professional sense. So today we will cover some principles of risk, the process for managing risk, and we will talk about methods to deal with the risk that we have identified. Cool, and it looks like we're still kind of letting people in. Cool, I think I see some new faces. Oops. Oh no. Here I am having technical difficulties again. Let me reshare my screen. Um, one second. Can you guys see my screen? Is it on the PowerPoint slide? Maybe. There we go. Okay. Chat. Okay, perfect. Thank you guys. I swear I'm usually more like technologically savvy. It's just Zoom is my like the bane of my existence. Um so anyways, some risk principles is one, obviously don't accept unnecessary risk. So if you have a way to easily just mitigate the risk right then and there, then obviously don't accept the risk. An example of this would be um, this weekend I tried to go, well, I did go to Monterey. Some of my friends were visiting, and we wanted to see the aquarium. And I got halfway up. I was flying a new plane, and I got up to altitude and realized that my transponder mode C stopped working. And if you guys have been studying your private pilot stuff, you probably know that you need a mode C transponder in order to land at a Class Charlie airspace. Um, so air traffic control told me that my transponder was not reporting my altitude, but they would give me a special clearance to go to the Class Charlie if I wanted to continue. And even though it was really nice of them to give me that special clearance, there was another airport right next to the aquarium that I easily could divert to, that would not involve me going into a busy airspace without a working transponder. So that would be an example of not accepting unnecessary risk. It was equally easy for me to just divert to an airport um, that was less busy. So it was super easy to mitigate, and I just took care of it right there. Um, Another really important concept is whoever is the person making the decisions to deal with risk is the person responsible for controlling them. Or sorry, the person who is taking on the risk is the person who is responsible for making the decisions about the risk. So this is just a way of saying that you are the pilot in command. So anyone who is, you're the person who would be ultimately, um, your license and your plane is at stake. So don't put the risk-making decisions on other people. Another example of this would be um, I had a flight. I remember I just got my instrument rating, and I wanted to take up my mom, and it was gonna be kind of cloudy. It was my first time like actually using my instrument rating. Um, and my mom was so excited to go on this trip. She like took time off of work. She went all the way out to the airport. It was like an hour drive. And as we got up to the airport, I started realizing that there was going to be some pretty, um, I saw that the weather had changed and there would be some pretty severe icing conditions. Um, so even though my mom really was like applying a lot of external pressures, ultimately I was the person who would be taking on the risk for myself. So I would be the person in charge of making those decisions. So that one's kind of, I feel like, common sense. But the next one is going to be that risk mitigation is a continuous process. So I think the FAA recommends beginning the risk management process, especially for big like cross-country trips or flights, at least 2 days out. And you are constantly reevaluating the risk even during flight. Some stuff might come up, like for example, that transponder or something sounding off about the plane or weather changing. That might change the level of risk that you are taking on. And really quick, I know that we added some more people. If we just want to take a break, I see some new faces. Are all of you guys working on your private pilot rating? Cool. I don't know if I can see the chat. Cool, private pilot. Okay, perfect. So a lot of this will end up being useful if you start implementing a lot of this early on in your private pilot. Especially, I feel like a lot of this comes into play um, for risk management as you are trying to grow as a pilot and expand your personal minimums. And also as you start to get into more complicated, like cross-country scenarios. So I'm glad that you guys are all here. That's a really awesome sign. Um, so the FAA discusses the risk management process as 3 steps: identifying risk, assessing the risk, and mitigating the risk. So, some really common tools to just identify the risks that you are taking on for a flight would be the PAVE checklist, which I'm going to get into. Um, the PAVE checklist is a comprehensive checklist for identifying risk, which would be dealing with the pilot, the aircraft, the environment, and the external pressures. And I'll get into each one of those a little more. There are some alternative checklists also that I'll get into, such as I'm safe or the 5 Ps. And those also are tools for identifying the risk. Um, and then the next step, besides just identifying the risk, is assessing the risk. So I'll get into on the next couple slides a couple other tools for assessing whether the risks outweigh the benefit of doing that particular flight. And then we'll kind of have some fun brainstorming ways that we can mitigate those risks that we assessed. So kind of jumping ahead. Um, a tool for identifying risk, like I just said, was the PAVE checklist. I have it kind of broken down here. Um, and I'll go into each one of these a little bit more. Um, there is also a very common risk identification tool known as the 5P model. And that stands for the plane, the pilot, the passengers, the programming, and the plan. Um, so you could either use the 5P model or the PAVE checklist for identifying risk. It's kind of personal preference, but today I'm going to talk a little bit more about the PAVE checklist and how you can apply it to scenarios. So that's step one, identifying the risk. Step two would be assessing the risk. So I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of a FRAT tool. FRAT tools stand for um, Flight Risk Assessment Table, and it allows you to identify the risks and then judge whether or not the risks outweigh the benefits of the flight. And it does that by identifying the risks and then talking about how probable. So it talks about the severity of the risk and then also the probability. So an example would be like an engine failure would be very, very severe, maybe catastrophic on that scale. However, it would be unlikely. So in that scenario, it balances out to be that the flight is still worth doing because the um, probability of an engine fi failure is very, very low. However, if you do certain things that could increase the probability of that engine failure, such as maybe not taking off with enough fuel for the day, or not doing your checklist and having the mixture too lean, those would be things that would increase the probability and maybe not make the flight worth doing. So, to be honest, I don't always do like a risk like go through a frat tool like this to assess the risks from each individual flight, but I do think that it's worth looking at these tools. They have some in the pilot handbook of aeronautical knowledge, and just getting used to assessing every flight, especially like long cross country flights, um, assessing it in this format, in like a very organized way. Another really awesome tool, which I have all my students print this out, especially, it's kind of blurry, but especially for check rides, I have my students write down their personal minimums. And the reason why I do this before a check ride is the students are used to flying with me, and I add a little buffer protecting them against certain risks. So before I turn them loose, where if they pass their check ride, they can fly in many conditions, in many new aircraft. I want them to write down exactly what their personal minimums are or their safety buffers they have built in for specific scenarios. So I would definitely recommend before you solo, but especially before you take your check ride, if you go onto the FAA website and type in FAA personal safety minimums, I think it's one of the first tabs that pops up. And I would recommend going through with your instructor and coming up with personal minimums, and write them down so that you can't um, fudge them or not stick to them if you experience any external pressures. I know it's kind of blurry, but this personal minimum handout talks about, let's see, if you have like not much experience with the aircraft, how many takeoffs and landings you want to do in the last however many days to feel comfortable. It also talks about familiarity with the avionics, and fuel reserves. And we'll kind of go into um, this talks a lot about tying back into the PAVE checklist, this one here. Um, so now I'll go ahead and break down the PAVE checklist a little more. Um, so the first P in PAVE would be the pilot. And this is our way of assessing if we are fit for a specific flight. And I'm sure you guys hear this a lot, but the I'm safe checklist is used frequently to assess if the pilot is fit for a flight. And that stands for illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but I'll go into a couple things a little deeper. Um, One would be if you are recovering from an illness as a pilot, specifically one that affects like your sinuses, please, please do not fly until you feel 100% better. I've had it a couple times where I thought I was better, and then I decided to go on a flight, and it is really, really painful, especially when you're descending and you can't pop your ears. Um, and I can't imagine how distracting that would be if you were solo and having to deal with that like sort of pain and deal with actually flying the plane. So please don't fly with illness, but especially if it's affecting your sinuses in any way. And going off of illness with medication, make sure that if you are taking a medication, that it is an FAA approved medication. The FAA, as well as I believe AOPA, has a list of medication that is approved for pilot usage. And if you are ever confused about whether a certain medication is allowed or not, um, you can refer to that list, or you could also contact your aviation medical doctor. So make sure that if you have any questions about whether or not a certain medication is legal, make sure that you are contacting an actual AME or aviation medical examiner instead of just a normal doctor. Um, Pretty much any medication that affects your faculties, like that might cause drowsiness, those would be banned. So I know off of experience, a lot of like allergy medication is not allowed for pilots to fly with. Um, for stress, I feel like stress and fatigue to me are pretty related. Um, There's been studies that if you are tired, and flying the plane from like either emotional or physical stress and fatigue, it equates to a certain point, it equates to flying under the influence of alcohol. So that's why the FAA has really emphasized rest rules. So for like the airline world, or if you are flying as an instructor, the FAA has lots of rest rules. Like for example, I cannot instruct for more than 8 hours in any 24-hour period. And the FAA has tons of rules on for commercial pilots on how long their duty days can be. However, most private pilots are flying under Part 91, where there are no regulations saying that the pilots have to legally limit themselves um, to flying to avoid this fatigue. So that's why it's so important that we're really like establishing personal minimums and um, keeping ourselves in check to make sure that we're not overflying our physical limits with emotional stress or fatigue. Another note on fatigue is it's been proven as well that by the time you are too tired to be safe to fly, it's probably past the point where you would have the faculties or the wherewithal to realize it. Um, so if you're super, super tired, not really with it, sometimes when you're at that point, you don't realize that you are at that point and you should discontinue the flight. So that's why I think it's super important that you refer to a tool like this and write down how much sleep you require in the previous night in order to fly, or write down how many hours you are willing to fly in a day before calling it quits. And I know from experience, I've been instructing a lot in California where we have like 100 degree days. And I know now that usually after like 3 flights, or maybe like the equivalent of 4 hours of flying in a tiny unair conditioned Cessna, no matter how much water I drink, I'm just done. I get home and I'm super tired. And I don't realize it in the plane when I'm flying, which is the scary part. So I think that's why, once again, going back to write down your personal minimums before you put yourself in that situation. Um, Cool. Does anyone have any questions so far or fun stories to tell about what we're talking about? Okay, cool. So then next we'll move into the aircraft part of the PAVE checklist. Um, so I kind of group the aircraft into the plane, programming, performance, and proficiency. So also by programming, I mean the avionics for that particular aircraft. So once you get your private pilot rating, you are legally allowed to fly pretty much any single engine aircraft that you have an endorsement for. So some aircraft, once you get your private pilot rating, like um, requires certain endorsements to fly, like tail wheel, high performance, retractable gear with a constant speed propeller, or like pressurized high altitude aircraft. All of those aircraft require specific endorsements to fly. But other than that, once you get your license, you are allowed to fly any plane. And that's why it becomes your responsibility to determine how much experience you want in a plane before you feel comfortable going up solo in it or taking passengers. Um, and I will say from experience, I think when I was under 500 hours, it took me a lot more time with an instructor to feel comfortable soloing in a new plane. Um, and then as you get experience flying more planes, it gets a little easier to transfer that knowledge to new planes. Um, but definitely establish personal minimums, like how many hours you want to spend um, with an instructor going over any new aircraft that you fly. Especially if it's an aircraft that requires an endorsement. So, um, I've had it before when I'm like giving out complex endorsements for aircrafts that have retractable landing gear. Um, where I felt comfortable with the student. They were flying it really well, and I was ready to give them their endorsement. But then the student themselves actually told me, like, hey, I don't feel comfortable with the landing gear yet. I think I'm gonna forget to do it sometime when I solo and like land gear up. And I like really respected that they were able to tell me, like, I don't feel comfortable soloing this plane yet. So I think that's a really awesome sign of decision making. Another thing with new aircraft is new avionics. So if you are, let's say, doing a cross country in a plane that you already know, but maybe it has different avionics, um, it might be really distracting if, for example, you're used to a G1000 glass cockpit and now you need to learn analog like a little old Garmin 430 or something. Or vice versa. I know that I recently like had to get refamiliar with a bunch of new avionics for the Cirrus and it was definitely distracting trying to go into like a busy airport and being like, wait, where is everything? Like I feel like I'm fumbling around a lot. Um, so my suggestion for dealing with new avionics is I know I've had a couple students come to me on they have downloaded like a Garmin simulator on their iPads. So if you're ever trying to get comfortable with your GPS or avionics setup, um, sometimes the maker of those avionics, which most of the time is Garmin, they have apps on the App Store or simulators so you can practice like tinkering around um, on the ground, not having to pay for the plane to get used to that setup. think I saw a chat. Okay, bye, Alyssa. Thanks for joining. I'm glad you were able to make it. Um, cool. Another way to get used to new avionics is I've had some instructors offer to have the plane plugged into like an external power source, and you can just sit with the master switch on and mess with the avionics on the ground. And that way you are not paying for flight time, and you can go through that with your instructor. The other thing with new aircraft is different aircraft have different performance numbers. So I know that a lot of flight schools emphasize something called a tolled card or a takeoff and landing distance card, um, which they have their students fill out every flight in addition to a weight and balance. So if you are flying a new plane, I think it is a really good idea to fill out one of these takeoff and landing distance cards or those tolled cards. You can probably find one online as well as do the weight and balance. And on top of that, with aircraft performance, um, a lot of the POHs and the flight manuals are giving you aircraft performance with like best case scenario, like perfect pilot technique, brand new engine. Um, so because of that, when I am calculating aircraft performance, I always give myself a little bit of a buffer. Usually for new pilots, I'll do a for a takeoff and landing distance, I'll add like a 30% buffer, or I'll add 30% to what the POH says I need for runway length. Um, and another thing is I'll pick an abort point. So, the other day I had a flight where the passengers um wanted to add a lot of baggage, and I did the numbers. Like I did the weight and balance. I made sure we were underweight and within parameters. I did the takeoff and landing distance, and it looked like we would be completely safe to take off, but I was still a little skeptical. So I picked an abort point. I was like, if I am not off the runway by the third taxiway, I'm going to go ahead and discontinue the takeoff and come to a stop. So I think that's a really good idea, especially on days where you are a little heavier or if it's high density altitude, to even talk to brief it with your instructor or your passengers that if you are not landed by a certain point or off the ground for a takeoff by a certain point, that you will discontinue the takeoff or go around. And this actually did remind me of a kind of unfortunate story. Like 2 weeks ago, someone from our airport was coming into an unfamiliar airport in a plane that she was unfamiliar with. It was like, I think, one of her first time soloing this plane. She was a commercial pilot, and she came in a little fast because, once again, it's a new plane. And she um she landed really long. She floated for a while. And by the time she realized that she wouldn't have enough runway to stop, she wasn't able to go around because there were trees in the way. And she ended up having to um, overrun the runway. So she was completely fine, but she did end up going off the runway, and it was probably embarrassing. I'm glad everyone was okay. But I think that that was something that could have been prevented if she just decided, like, this is a new plane for me, this is a new runway. Um, if I'm not down by like within 1,000 feet of the touchdown zone, I'm gonna go around. Um, Another concept is I know that this is a really big check ride question, which is what is currency versus proficiency? Does anyone have an answer to that or want to try to put it in their own words? You
I
can
can
unmute
try.
yourself. Yeah.
I think that currency is like oh okay, let me start with proficiency because I know I actually
Yeah.
kind of know that one. It's like being good at something like for example the G1000 being able to use the G1000 proficiently, and then currency is basically what the FAA needs you to be able to do, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. Um, yeah, I really liked that. And I think Christian also said currency is the required takeoff and landings for passengers. So yeah, you guys are both right. Currency is what the FAA says is legal to fly. Um, whereas proficiency is what you're capable of flying or how confident you are to fly. Or should say what your ability is in that given scenario. So currency would be you need to have a minimum of 3 takeoffs and landings in 90 days, or at night, you need it to be at night, to a full stop. And then the flight review. So legally, and I have seen this happen before as a flight instructor, legally, someone can go 2 years or a little less than 2 years without flying a plane. And as long as they're not taking passengers, they can go fly it or go rent a plane and fly it after not flying for, let's say, 18 months. So that is legal. They are technically current to fly. However, it's probably not safe and they're probably not proficient. This also comes in with instrument flying too. For instrument and night flying, I feel like proficiency is really, really important. Does anybody else have any ideas for mitigating risk with new aircraft or avionics? Something that maybe I didn't think of or say. Well, okay. Anyways, you guys can say something in the chat. I'll go ahead and move on to environment. Um, so environment, I think of personal weather minimums. So once again, going back to this little brochure or FAA printout of personal minimums, um, a big one would be crosswinds. I know a lot of people are not super comfortable in windy conditions, especially with crosswinds. So with that, I would say establish personal minimums based off of your aircraft's maximum demonstrated crosswind component in the POH. Um, and especially in dealing with clouds and visibility, if you are instrument rated, there's definitely a big variety of like maybe you're instrument rated, but you only want to go if like you just pop through the occasional cloud versus being in like hard IFR conditions with like solid fog for the whole flight. Um, so I would like establish personal minimums for that if you are instrument rated. Um, I think that it is really healthy for you as a pilot to try to expand your personal minimums, specifically with like crosswinds. Um, However, if you are going to try to expand your personal minimums with winds or crosswinds, I would go up with an instructor and make sure that on a windy day and make sure that that is something that you feel comfortable with before you try solo. Um, Another thing, this is also another quick note about crosswinds. I think it was a couple months ago. Um, I was flying and I heard a student pilot on the radio just having to do like go around after go around because they couldn't get it down on a windy day. It was a really strong crosswind. So I ended up going up on the radio and telling the pilot that an airport maybe like, well, sorry, someone else came in the waiting room. I ended up telling them that like an airport nearby had it was the same amount of wind, but it was directly aligned down the center line instead of it being a crosswind. So just keep that in mind too if you ever are in that position where the crosswinds are a little too much for you solo. Um, you can try to divert to an airport where the wind is more oriented towards the runway. So that's weather. Also getting a weather briefing is really important. Does anyone want to talk about how they get their weather briefings before a flight? You can say it in the chat too.
Oh, hey everyone, my name's Christian. I was encouraged to call aviation weather,
hmm
and only because is what I want to say.
Yeah, no, that's a
Yeah,
good
it's
one.
pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah. So Christian has a really good point. You can call 1-800-WX brief. They also have a website and call a weather briefer. And they will go through um, basically any inclement weather conditions. They will say if VFR flight will be possible. They'll tell you any NOTAMs in addition to any like large weather systems that are going through. So I really like Christian's point about calling a weather briefer. And what I'll usually do is go on ForeFlight and get a weather briefing on ForeFlight so that I can already kind of have an idea of what's going on. And then that way I'll have some questions going into it by the time I call someone. But yeah, that was a good answer. Um, Next, I was going to say how to mitigate the risk of flying into a new airport. For me, one thing that makes me nervous about flying into a new airport is depending on how confusing the airport is. There's the possibility of a runway incursion, which a runway incursion is just accidentally entering the runway environment when you were not cleared to. Um, or when someone else is on the runway, or maybe not even being able to like find the airport is all things that I um like that was something for me as a student pilot that I would get really nervous about. Um and I would try to mitigate the stress around arriving at a new airport by calling the um FBOs ahead of time. So even like this past week, I was going into a really big airport. I wasn't sure where I was gonna park. Um, so I called an FBO, which is just like the pilot services or like a lounge basically one of the companies that provides pilot services at the airport. And I called them and I made sure that they had the proper fuel and I asked them where they were parked or where they were oriented, um, like what taxiway they were off of, so that way I could kind of plan where I needed to exit the runway um, after landing and what my taxi route was in general gonna look like. Um, So that's a really good idea. Plus, calling the FBO or any uh, lounge or business at the airport is really helpful because you might be able to ask them some questions about the airport, like that you wouldn't otherwise know, such as like if there's landing fees or any weird services you should know about. Um, you can also check the airport chart supplement if you are going into a new airport, and they will have some good information too. Another thing, if you are going into a new airport, is reviewing a taxi diagram. Do any of you guys know what hotspots are? Has anyone heard of a hotspot?
Yeah, I have. This is Miranda. Sorry, I'm late to the party.
Okay. Oh no, that's fine.
Area that is not necessarily visible by the tower,
Mhm.
or there might be area of like accidents that could happen as a result. So that's usually what I consider a hotspot.
Yeah, exactly. So on a taxi diagram, specifically for towered airports, there will be a like little shaded area or a circled area, um, which denotes a hotspot. And hotspots are areas on the taxi diagram where there maybe by the design of the airport, it's a really confusing area, or there might have been like an accident or an incident that occurred there. So it's just a warning to be extra careful. So if you are coming into a new airport, I would look at those hot spots and maybe even look up, hang on, I'm gonna try to pull up a really confusing airport I've been to, so you guys can see the hot spots. Um, but even like looking on Google Maps or Google Earth satellite view, um, and seeing if you can figure out why that's so confusing before you're like trying to taxi. Um, Here, I'm gonna pull up this airport. I hate it so much. Every time I'm there, I'm like, why did they design the airport like this? It's Concord Airport in California, if any of you guys have been there. But it just has so many, here it is. It has so many intersecting runways. And if you see where my mouse is, all these little circles are hotspots or confusing areas. So I would, if I'm going into a new airport, specifically if it's towered, look for these hotspots and maybe try to figure them out on Google Maps or something. Um, like for example, I know this intersection's really confusing. Like you don't know. Sometimes you like lose track of where to turn. Another really important thing about calling, like seeing where you're parking before you go to the airport is at an airport like this, for example. Um, Air traffic control or the tower won't always tell you which direction to exit the runway off of. So if you're landing on, it looks like this runway is one left, and you don't already know where you're going to turn, um, you might accidentally turn like into this side of the airport instead of towards where you're supposed to park. And then it's kind of a pain in the butt. So that's why that's always like a part of my planning. Um, Another idea for dealing with new airports or busy airspace um, is listening to live ATC. Um, so I listen to it when I drive sometimes. Are any of you guys like not familiar with the live ATC app? Maybe. Okay, cool. So yeah, live ATC lets you listen into real life air traffic control conversations. And I know that when I was going into like Bravo airspace for the first time as a new pilot, I was really nervous. So I would listen to the air traffic control conversations around the airspace so I could kind of hear like how busy it is or what to expect. Um, and then my last thing about the environment is night flying is a really added risk um, for your just like general flying. So flying at night can be really disorienting. So if you are not proficient with night flying, let's say it's been a while, I would completely recommend going up with an instructor until you're comfortable, or just taking another experienced pilot friend with you. Um, Some other stuff about night flying is unless you have a really good GPS, it can be, or like navigation method, it can be really easy to get lost. So make sure that you are picking lit waypoints, so like stadiums or freeways. Um, Actually, usually if I'm night flying VFR, um, I'll try to follow some sort of freeway because one, they're easy to see at night, but also if I lost an engine at night, it's a lot easier to circle down onto like something that you know is a freeway rather than gliding down to a dark patch and not knowing if it's like the woods or like a lake or a nice little field. Um, Another thing with night flying, which is another kind of unfortunate story, but there's a lot of critters out at night. And I know I've had it when I'm with students, we'll like line up to take off and we'll see like some little coyote eyes staring back at us. So make sure that you're taxiing slower and kind of taking that time. We did have a really unfortunate incident. Oh, about a month ago. It was kind of funny. I was doing a guy's flight review and um I have to like go over a ground scenario. So we went over the scenario that his one of his landing gear all of a sudden stopped working. So we like talked about what to do, how he would handle the situation, like where he would divert to. And then like 2 weeks later, he was flying out of a little mountain airport at night and he hit a deer and it like just sheared off his landing gear, like the exact gear that we talked about in the scenario. So he did exactly what we talked about 2 weeks earlier and ended up the plane was totaled, but he did divert and landed safely. Um, but yeah, definitely don't put yourself in a scenario where there is a deer on the runway that can shear off your landing gear. Just take the time to taxi slowly and make sure that the runway is actually clear before you add takeoff power. Um, okay, last slide. We're almost done. Um, the last part of the PAVE checklist is managing external pressures. So this can be self-imposed by get there-itis. So if you are finding yourself rushing, it could be really easy to maybe not get fuel or forego checklists. I know when I took all my friends to Monterey a couple days ago, an example would be we were running a little bit late and my friends wanted to get back to the airport by like a certain time and we had enough fuel to get back home, but it would be like right at my like 30-minute minimums. Um, which I would not want to do if like we had to go around or get lost or something. So even though I wanted to get back and my friends like wanted to get back, we stopped and got fuel just for my peace of mind. So that would be an example of managing risks, but also managing expectations of passengers. Um, so going off of that, um, as a rule of thumb, I try to never offer to fly friends or family if it is an event that we absolutely have to be at. So going back to this Monterey example, my friends wanted to buy the aquarium tickets for Monterey Bay Aquarium like 2 weeks in advance, which they're kind of expensive. They were like $70. So I was trying to manage expectations and I told my friends not to get the tickets until the day of, because that I know would put a lot of pressure on me to make the flight work if something was like looking fishy or the weather wasn't good. Um, I just realized my pun, looking fishy. But um so building in like contingency plans too. Um So if you do know that you're going somewhere with your passengers and there's a chance that you could get stuck there, let's say like the weather's not good or the plane breaks, or maybe not, if there's like maybe something inoperative with the plane, making sure that you have a backup plan. So if you are going to fly like a couple hours away and then come back, make sure that you are in a position where you could get like a hotel or a rental car if you get stuck. So you're not trying to like make unsafe decisions or feeling pressured to make unsafe decisions to get out. As a rule of thumb, I usually try to, anytime I'm like flying somewhere where I like need to be there, I'll come up with like a backup route if the weather isn't good that day. So like I'll drive or buy a commercial ticket. Um, and if I am flying, depending on the length of the flight, I'll usually add about 1.5 to 2 hours of a delay. So I'm not rushing or like making silly decisions that I normally wouldn't do. Um, I think there was a case study. I'll end it on this like sad note. There was this case study a couple years ago where this guy, I think he was coming from like San Jose and needed to go to Nevada for a family wedding. Um, he ended up, because it was a family wedding, his family members were counting on him to fly them there, and not be late. He ended up taking off into some thunderstorms when, if he had just waited a little bit, he would have been fine. And they all ended up like passing away, unfortunately. But that would be a really good example of like maybe have a backup plan if you're flying general aviation somewhere where you can't miss it, or maybe just plan to go a couple days earlier so you have time. But that pretty much wraps up all of my slides. Um, so key notes are just establish personal minimums with your instructor. I like using this one from the FAA, and establish some sort of like PAVE or the 5P checklist um, to identify the risks that you are doing. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, thank you for this presentation.
Yeah.
I believe that pilots or anybody just needs exposure. And this is probably, I've been exposed to this like 3 times. And I'm now encouraged to really sit down with my ground instructor for personal minimums. But this is recorded, so how can I get my hands on this record and play it back?
Oh, that is a really good question. I will, once again, I'm like not the most tech savvy person. So in theory, it should be recorded and posted to the Girls Love to Fly website after
Okay.
this.
Okay.
It should be pretty quickly. And if you want to put your email down in the chat, I can let you know once it's up.
I'll do that.
Okay, perfect. And then I think I see
Right.
another.
Thank you so much. I have to go. So everyone have a good evening.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining. It was awesome having you here. Cool. Any other comments or questions or any suggestions for future ground school topics?
I have a quick question, and I'm going to
Mhm.
talk to my instructor about this too. Um, so 99% of my flight training was in Florida. So
Mhm.
all the weather stuff is completely different. And when I made personal minimums, I don't think they'll fit in the California weather. So do
Mhm.
you think that it would be a good idea to kind of switch those and
Yeah.
maybe fly a little bit?
What way is it different? Is it like the winds or?
Yeah, so they let us fly in Florida all the way up to like gusting 30 knots, and I don't think that applies here, especially because I think the 150 wouldn't be able to handle that anyway.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that that's a good point with the 150 in particular. I think it's good to always judge your crosswind comfort off of the max demonstrated crosswind for that plane. Because
Okay.
some planes, specifically a 150, the
Mhm.
wind affects it a little bit differently. Um, in that scenario, I would say it depends. Like, if you don't think that you're flying in wind that often, um, then you probably are losing some of that proficiency that you got in Florida. Um, where in California are you doing your training?
Oh God, Roseville? Roseville.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So I teach out of Auburn. So um
Okay, cool.
in that scenario, I would recommend you go up with your instructor. Um, the Marysville Airport, for example, has a crosswind runway. So no matter what the wind is doing, like 90% of the time it has a pretty decent crosswind.
Okay.
And I would maybe do a bunch of landings with that crosswind runway and assess if you still feel comfortable managing those winds.
And
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah,
I'd add that Vacaville and Rio Vista have pretty good winds there too that are up in that range. So if you want
Okay,
help.
cool.
yeah,
Thank you.
actually, that's a good point. Vacaville probably gets windier than or Rio Vista probably gets a lot windier, so that would be a good one. Cool. Any other comments?
Where can I find the flat tool that you showed us?
Oh, the frat tool. Was it this
Flat
guy?
tool.
Oops, were you
Yes.
thinking about this table? It is in the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge. They have their own chapter on risk. Um, it was just being a pain in the butt. I couldn't like put it into the PowerPoint without it being blurry. So this one is slightly different. This one I just found on Google Images if I just typed in frat tool. But there's a more official one in the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Any last questions or comments? Oh, does anyone have any like exciting trail training milestones coming up, like a check ride or a solo? Well, I'm sure they'll be coming up. Um, cool. Well, thank you guys all so much for joining. Oh, sorry, I see one chat. Oh, thank you, Dasha. Um, cool. Okay. Well, if anybody has any suggestions on what they want to hear next, please email Girls Love to Fly. Or I'll put my personal email in the chat right now if anybody wants to reach out with any questions, just if you wanted to ask a CFI any training questions. Cool. Okay, I just put my email in if anyone wants to reach out. Other than that, I hope you guys have a good rest of your Tuesday, and I really appreciate you guys showing up. We'll see you guys.